There's something deeply confusing that happens when an avoidant meets a super empath. At first, the avoidant feels emotionally safe in the connection because they believe they are the one controlling the distance. They decide when to get close, when to disappear, when to reply, and when to emotionally pull away. For a long time, this pattern protects their ego because most people react emotionally to avoidance. Most people chase harder when they feel distance. They overthink every silence. They try to prove their love. They become emotionally louder the colder the avoidant becomes. And secretly, this gives the avoidant a sense of emotional control. Not because they are evil or intentionally manipulative all the time, but because emotional distance became their defense mechanism long ago. Somewhere in their past, vulnerability stopped feeling safe. Depending on people started feeling dangerous, so they learned how to survive by staying emotionally guarded. But then they meet a super empath, and that changes everything. Because a super empath does love deeply, they care intensely. They try to understand emotional pain at a level most people never do. They are patient with wounds other people would run away from. At first, the avoidant feels comfortable with this. The empath keeps trying, keeps understanding, keeps forgiving, keeps emotionally showing up even when the avoidant becomes distant or confusing. But eventually, something unexpected happens. The empath becomes emotionally exhausted. Not dramatic, not angry, just tired. Tired of carrying the emotional weight of the connection alone. And slowly, the empath starts changing. They stop chasing every silence. They stop over explaining their feelings. They stop trying to force emotional closeness from someone emotionally unavailable. And this silent shift hits the avoidant harder than people realize, because avoidants pay attention to energy more than words. Even when they act detached, they notice emotional changes immediately. They notice when your replies become calmer. They notice when your attention becomes less desperate. They notice when you stop emotionally panicking over their distance. And suddenly, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar: loss of emotional control. Because the dynamic they secretly relied on is disappearing. They expected you to always react, always wait, always emotionally reach for them. But now, you seem emotionally grounded without them, and that quietly damages their ego. Because deep down, many avoidants feel secure when they know someone is emotionally attached to them, no matter how distant they become. It gives them reassurance without requiring vulnerability from them. But when the super empath emotionally pulls back, the avoidant starts questioning themselves. They begin wondering why your energy feels different, why you seem less emotionally dependent, why your silence suddenly feels heavier than before. And this creates anxiety inside them they rarely show openly. Because now, for the first time, the avoidant starts feeling emotionally uncertain. What if they no longer need me? That thought affects avoidance deeply, much more deeply than they admit. Because avoidants often fear emotional dependence, but they also fear being emotionally forgotten. And when the empath stops revolving emotionally around them, the avoidant feels their importance inside the connection starting to weaken. That realization quietly attacks their ego. This is why some avoidants suddenly return after periods of silence, acting strangely emotional, curious, or attentive. Not necessarily because they fully healed overnight, but because the empath's emotional detachment created insecurity inside them, an insecurity they can no longer control through distance. And the most painful part for the avoidant is this: the super empath usually becomes peaceful during this shift. Not bitter, not hateful, just emotionally stronger. And that calm emotional strength unsettles the avoidant more than anger ever could. Because anger still means emotional attachment, but calm detachment? That feels like losing emotional access completely. And many avoidants are far more affected by that than they will ever admit. After the silent shift begins, the avoidant usually does something very predictable. They test the connection. Not always directly, not always openly, But emotionally, they start checking if you are still the same person who used to chase, explain, and emotionally react to everything. Because in their mind, the old pattern is still expected to repeat. They assume your emotional availability is permanent. So they might go silent for a while, delay responses, or act slightly distant, just to see what you do. And in the past, this usually worked. You would come closer. You would ask questions. You would try to fix the emotional gap. You would overthink their silence. And this gave the avoidant a sense of emotional stability without them having to fully engage. But now, something different happens. You don't react the same way anymore. You don't immediately chase. You don't emotionally panic. You don't over-explain your feelings just to keep them close. Instead, your energy becomes calm and controlled. And this is where the avoidant starts feeling uncomfortable, because the emotional feedback they used to rely on is no longer there. Now their silence is met with silence. Their distance is met with emotional stillness. And for an avoidant, this feels unfamiliar, because avoidants are used to controlling emotional intensity in relationships. When things get too close, they pull away. When things get too quiet, they expect the other person to increase emotional effort. But when both sides become calm, the emotional system they are used to stops working. And this is where the ego damage starts happening quietly. The avoidant begins to notice something they don't say out loud. You are no longer emotionally easy to access, and that creates internal confusion. Because part of them expected you to always be emotionally available, no matter what they did. But now, you are not overgiving anymore. You are not over-explaining anymore. You are not emotionally reacting in the same way anymore. And this shift slowly changes how they see you. They start paying more attention. They start reading your behavior differently. They start noticing the absence of your emotional urgency. And that absence creates curiosity. Because avoidants often confuse emotional intensity with emotional value. When you were reacting strongly, they felt your attachment. But when you become calm, they can no longer easily read your emotional position. And that uncertainty hits them harder than they expect. Because avoidants don't just fear closeness, they also fear losing emotional control over how someone feels about them. Now, instead of you trying to understand them, they start trying to understand you. Why are you not reacting the same way? Why are you not emotionally chasing anymore? Why does it feel like you are slowly detaching? And this is where something very subtle begins inside them. They start observing you more. Not necessarily reaching out more, but watching more. Your behavior, your timing, your emotional tone. Because now they are trying to figure out if they are still emotionally important to you. And for the first time, the avoidant is placed in the position they usually avoid the most: emotional uncertainty about their own place in someone's life. And that slowly starts affecting their ego in a quiet but deep way. Because the emotional control they once had is no longer guaranteed. And when that control starts slipping, the avoidant doesn't always show panic. They show distance again. But this time, it's different, because it's not fully confident distance anymore. It's confused distance. And that confusion is the beginning of emotional instability inside them. There is a specific point in this dynamic that the avoidant never really prepares for. It's not when you get angry. It's not when you argue. It's not even when you leave temporarily. It's when you become emotionally self-contained. Because a super empath doesn't always leave loudly. Sometimes they leave emotionally, while still being physically present. And that's what confuses the avoidant the most. At first, the avoidant may think nothing serious is happening. They may assume you are just giving space, or being moody, or pulling back temporarily. But slowly, your emotional energy stops matching theirs. You stop over-investing in their silence. You stop trying to decode every mixed signal. You stop making them the center of your emotional world. And this is where something uncomfortable begins inside the avoidant. They start feeling replaceable. Not in a logical way, in an emotional way. because avoidants are often used to being the emotionally unavailable one in the connection. They are used to being the one who controls closeness, the one who decides how much access you get, the one who can disappear and still be emotionally relevant. But when the super empath detaches emotionally, that structure collapses. Now the avoidant is no longer the center of emotional gravity, and this is deeply unsettling for them, because they start noticing things they ignored before. Your silence feels different. Your replies feel less emotionally charged. Your presence feels less emotionally dependent. And instead of comfort, it creates insecurity. They begin to wonder things they never used to question. If I am not actively engaging, do they still feel attached to me? If I disappear again, will they even try to reach me? And these thoughts slowly create internal pressure, because avoidants don't like emotional uncertainty about their own importance. They may act like they don't care, but internally they do register emotional shifts, especially from someone they were once used to having emotional access to. And now that access feels less guaranteed. This is where their ego starts reacting quietly. They may not express it directly, but their behavior often changes in subtle ways. Sometimes they reappear more suddenly. Sometimes they try to test emotional reactions again. Sometimes they observe from a distance longer than usual, because they are trying to confirm something internally. Am I still emotionally significant to this person? But the super empath is no longer responding from the same emotional place, and that is what makes this stage powerful. Because the empath is no longer proving anything, no longer chasing clarity, no longer fighting for emotional validation, no longer trying to hold the connection alone. And the avoidant can feel this shift, even if nothing is said out loud, because energy changes are louder to them than words. Now the avoidant is stuck in something they don't like: emotional ambiguity. They cannot fully read you anymore. They cannot fully predict your reaction anymore. And they cannot assume your emotional availability anymore. This creates a quiet but deep ego disruption, because avoidants are used to emotional distance as a tool they control. But here, distance is no longer under their control. It is now mutual, and that changes the entire psychological balance. And this is where the fourth sign begins. Because when the avoidant starts feeling emotionally irrelevant, they don't always move closer in a healthy way. They often react in ways that reveal their internal conflict even more. At this stage, something subtle but very important starts happening inside the avoidant. They begin to lose emotional predictability. Earlier, they could predict you. They knew your reactions. They knew your emotional limits. They knew you would eventually come back into emotional engagement no matter how distant they acted. That predictability gave them comfort, even if they never admitted it. But now, that pattern is broken, and the avoidant starts feeling it. Because your emotional responses are no longer automatic. You are no longer reacting from anxiety. You are no longer trying to fix emotional silence immediately. You are no longer giving reassurance just to stabilize the connection. Instead, your energy feels controlled. And this is where the avoidant starts shifting internally. They don't always show it directly, but they begin paying more attention to you again. Not necessarily through communication, but through observation. They notice when you are online. They notice your timing. They notice changes in your tone. They notice emotional distance that feels more stable than before. And this creates something very uncomfortable for them. They start feeling emotionally out of sync with you, because they can no longer predict where they stand in your emotional world. And for avoidants, this is one of the most triggering internal experiences. They are used to being the one who creates emotional uncertainty, but now they are experiencing it, and it slowly affects their ego, because they start realizing something they never expected. You are not reacting the way you used to, and instead of emotional urgency from your side, there is calm distance. This is where avoidants often begin to test the connection again. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes they reappear casually. Sometimes they send random messages. Sometimes they try to check if your emotional door is still open. But the intention is deeper than the action. They are trying to restore emotional predictability, because unpredictability makes them uncomfortable. And now the emotional balance has shifted. You are no longer emotionally chasing. You are no longer emotionally overgiving. You are no longer emotionally easy to access. And the avoidant can feel that change without needing explanations. This is where ego conflict becomes stronger inside them, because part of them is used to being emotionally in control of the distance, but now they feel like they are losing that control. And when avoidants lose control of emotional access, they often react in contradictory ways. They may become colder again, or suddenly more interested, or inconsistent in their presence. Not because they are stable, but because they are internally trying to regulate the emotional discomfort. And underneath all of this is a deeper realization forming slowly. They are not as emotionally unaffected as they thought. Because if they truly didn't care, your calm distance wouldn't affect them at all. But it does. And that is the part they struggle with internally. Because it forces them to see something uncomfortable. You are no longer emotionally predictable for them, but they are still emotionally affected by you. And this imbalance creates silent ego pressure. They cannot fully detach, but they also cannot fully control the connection anymore. And this is exactly where the final shift begins. Because when the avoidant realizes they are emotionally losing access to you, the reaction becomes even more intense internally. At this final stage, something very quiet happens inside the avoidant. They don't usually express it openly. They don't admit it directly. And they definitely don't show it in a straightforward emotional way. But internally, they feel it clearly. They are losing emotional access to you. Not because you blocked them, not because you created drama, but because you emotionally changed your position in their life. You are no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. And this is where the avoidance ego gets affected the most. Because earlier, even when they pulled away, they still felt you were emotionally there, still waiting, still reacting, still emotionally available beneath the surface. That created a silent sense of security for them. But now, that sense is gone. And what replaces it is something they are not comfortable with: uncertainty. They start realizing that your emotional energy is no longer revolving around them. And this creates a deeper internal reaction than they show on the outside. Because avoidants are not just afraid of closeness, they are also afraid of losing emotional significance. And when they feel that shift, they don't always respond in healthy ways. Instead, their behavior becomes emotionally mixed. Sometimes they may come closer suddenly. Sometimes they may act completely indifferent. Sometimes they may observe you silently from a distance. Sometimes they may reappear without explanation. But all of these actions come from the same place: trying to regain emotional relevance in your life. Because now they can sense something different. You are no longer emotionally waiting. You are no longer emotionally chasing. You are no longer emotionally stuck. And that changes everything for them internally. Because for the first time, the avoidant is forced to confront a reality they usually avoid. The connection is no longer guaranteed. And when something becomes emotionally uncertain for an avoidant, their mind starts replaying everything. Not in a loud way, in a quiet, repetitive way. They think about what changed. They think about when they lost control. They think about how your energy shifted without drama. And most importantly, they think about whether they still matter to you in the same way. Because deep down, even avoidants want emotional significance. They may hide it behind distance. They may protect themselves with silence. They may act like they don't care. But losing emotional importance hits them harder than they admit. And this is why the super empath dynamic feels so powerful in this situation. Because the empath didn't fight loudly. They didn't beg, they didn't argue endlessly, they didn't try to force emotional closeness anymore. They simply evolved emotionally. And that evolution is what silently disrupts the avoidant's ego. Because now the avoidant is left with something unfamiliar, a connection they can no longer control, and a person they can no longer emotionally predict. And that is exactly why they start feeling the impact internally, not through words, but through silence. And in silence, they realize something very important. They didn't lose control over you. They lost emotional access to someone who stopped revolving around them. And that realization is what completes the silent ego shift.